Okay, imagine this. You pick up an ancient epic. You're expecting stories about gods and heroes, right? But what if, buried in those same texts, you found incredibly detailed descriptions of flying machines, anti-gravity, and even weapons that sound shockingly powerful? That's the mystery we're diving into. Are we talking about poetic license, or could these be records of some lost technology?
I mean, listen to that. That's a quote from the Mahabharata. It doesn't exactly sound like they're talking about swords and arrows, does it? As brilliant as 10,000 suns. That's the kind of language that makes you sit up and really question what was going on in the ancient world. It's our first clue that maybe, just maybe, there's more to these stories than meets the eye. And this is really the heart of it all. These texts talk about advanced flying machines they called Vimanas. And they weren't just simple flying carpets. They were supposedly powered by something that sounds a lot like anti-gravity and armed with weapons of just terrifying force. The wild part is, they're often described with a surprising amount of detail. So let's start by looking at what the most famous epics actually say.
Right, so our first stop is the source material itself, the big ones, the foundational epics of ancient India. What do these texts really tell us? You've probably heard of this one. This is the Pushpaka Vimana from the Ramayana. The text calls it an aerial and excellent car that can go anywhere the pilot wants. Think about that for a second. It's not just a magic chariot being pulled by horses. It's described as a vehicle that has controlled flight, one that can climb up into the higher atmosphere whenever it's told to. And this wasn't just a one-off mention. The Mahabharata, well, it takes things to a whole other level. It talks about massive flying cities. And at the same time, it mentions individuals having their own personal, smaller Vimanas. This paints a picture of a world where flying wasn't just some rare miracle, but maybe even a common form of travel. And what's really fascinating is that the texts don't just describe one kind of Vimana. It's like a whole catalog of different flying machines. You have circular, two-story craft with portholes and a dome. You've got long, cigar-shaped ships. Some are even named for how many engines they have, while others are named after animals they look like. This much detail suggests a really sophisticated and diverse technology, not just a single simple myth. So, okay, we've got the epic stories, the legends, but what about the nuts and bolts? Let's dig into the texts that some people claim are actual blueprints for these things. Now, this is the big one for a lot of believers, the Vaimanika Shastra. It was written down in the early 1900s, but the claim is that it's a copy of a much, much older text. And it's not a story. It's presented as a technical manual, a how-to guide for building and flying Vimanas. And the abilities it describes, they're just astounding. This is just a handful of the 32 secrets for pilots. We're talking about becoming invisible, camouflage, knocking enemies unconscious. You can supposedly see inside enemy aircraft, paralyze the people inside them, and even listen in on their conversations. I mean, come on, that sounds less like ancient mythology and more like a spec sheet for a modern stealth fighter. But how did they fly? This is where it gets really interesting. The texts don't just say magic. One of the wildest concepts, found in books like the Samarangana Sutradra, is something called a mercury vortex engine. The idea was that if you heated mercury, you could create this powerful spinning vortex that would generate lift. It's a propulsion system that's completely different from anything we use today. And this is where people really try to connect the dots. You can see how these ancient ideas about mercury engines are being compared to speculative futuristic designs for anti-gravity aircraft. The visual similarities, well, they're pretty hard to ignore. Of course, these ideas didn't just stay locked away in ancient books. Let's take a look at how they got a new lease on life in the modern world and who was pushing them. Yeah, this whole fascination with ancient Indian tech really blew up in the modern era. It started picking up steam with people like Colonel Olcott in the late 1800s. It was even seriously considered by actual scientists like the physicist Frederick Soddy. And then, of course, it just exploded into pop culture with Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. And here is a really specific, really compelling story. This old newspaper article is about a man named Shivkar Bapuji Talpade. Now, the story goes that he built and flew an unmanned aircraft way back in 1895, based on these very same Vedic texts. If that's true, it happened 8 years before the Wright brothers, and it would completely rewrite the history of flight as we know it. Okay, so we've looked at the incredible stories, the supposed blueprints, but to really get a handle on all of this, we have to take a big step back. We need a way to even think about this information in the first place. And this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Are we looking at science here, or spirituality, or something else completely? Are we maybe trying to fit an ancient square peg into a modern round hole?
So this brings us to the absolute core of the whole debate. There are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the world here. On one side, you've got empirical science, our modern method that builds knowledge from physical, testable proof. But on the other side, you have what's often called Vedic science. It starts from a totally different place. The assumption is that ancient scriptures already contain deep truths, and that consciousness, not matter, is the fundamental stuff of the universe. They're not just using different methods, they're aiming for totally different things.
And this quote just captures that second viewpoint perfectly. The idea isn't that the old texts predicted our modern gadgets. It's that modern science is finally mature enough to ask the really big questions. Questions that this ancient, spiritual science has had the answers to all along. So, why are we talking about this? Why does digging into these ancient stories of flying machines matter to us? Right here, right now, what's the big takeaway? Look, the point of this whole thing isn't really to prove or disprove any of it. It's about exploring this really fascinating cultural phenomenon. It tells us something really deep about ourselves, about our very human need to connect our ancient wisdom with our modern science. It's about wanting to believe that our ancestors were just as brilliant as we think we are. This quote from way back in 1944 just hits the nail on the head. Something that was easily dismissed as just a fairy tale, a fantasy, suddenly doesn't seem so impossible once our own technology starts to catch up. The things we invent today can completely change how we read the stories of the past. So were they real? Were they just powerful metaphors? In the end, how we choose to answer that question actually says a lot more about us, right now, than it does about the ancient past. It really reveals our own search for wonder, for a connection to something grand, and for a sense of meaning in an age that's so dominated by technology.